Well, it's become a bit of a tradition in Formula One, I think. The poor Japanese fans sitting there in the rain over the years, being very patient, very long suffering, particularly, and it doesn't seem to have changed this year either, particularly as there doesn't seem to be much else on the race card at Suzuka. I mean, if you compare the Japanese Grand Prix with, I don't know, the Singapore Grand Prix or the Australian Grand Prix, which is non-stop noise, action and events going on, Suzuka is Formula One. Don't even talk or look at anything else. And so, as I say, long-suffering fans, the Japanese Grand Prix on again, all delighted. And I suppose for them, when they get away from Alonso in the pit lane or from Lando Norris, that is enough, isn't it? It's a very nice, it's a very charming audience for Formula One. I think Japan, lovely to see it back on the calendar. Guan Yu Zhou hadn't been there before. No surprise there, really. I mean, he is a rookie and we've been off the calendar for a while. So a couple of drivers not having seen the track before, but in general, everybody delighted to be back at Suzuka again. What a great circuit it is. I talked about it a little bit in the live stream we did a couple of days ago. And it just brought everything back, really. Turn 1A, 1B, the S's, getting the top of the hill right before Dunlop, the understeer through Degner, which inevitably called out Carlos Sainz when he was out there running. What is this understeer? How do I get rid of it? You just can't on that downhill right-hander. It's always going to be there, Carlos. And and just how good it is. 130R in the dry will be, I think, very much like Eau Rouge. It's a lovely bit of road, but will be flat. It wasn't, though, in the wet, the semi-wet that we had today. Well, wet, actually. It was either wet or very wet. We had Nicholas Latifi going down 2 gears through there. We had a couple of drivers going down 1 gear, a couple going through flat, or in top gear anyway. And then, of course, the chicane, the final chicane. Historical chicane in view of everything that's happened there in the past, but a very difficult corner in the sense that it falls away from you and you see the grandstands in the distance. Very different from normal chicanes. Quite easy to be unsighted going into the chicane in the sense of knowing exactly where the braking area is. And one of the few places on any circuit in the world where you see drivers occasionally braking too early rather than too late because it just doesn't feel right. I think Nicholas Latifi today, actually on a slow lap, came in on the wrong bit of road anyway and just suddenly found himself up against a guardrail. So that just shows if you're not focused and you're not really thinking about it, there's quite a lot of stuff going on into that chicane. Anyway, kind of ahead of myself. Today in the wet, today on Friday, it was supposed to be a day in FP2 when the teams are going to look at the 2023 range of Pirelli tyres, but of course it was wet, so that was scrubbed, but they did keep the 90-minute session instead of the normal 60-minute. Quite why they did that is another question, I suppose, just to give the fans good value for money, and it kind of worked out because the rain came and went, but the track was reasonably good towards the end, and we had a couple of quick drivers out on intermediates, sort of throwing times back at one another, which was quite good fun. But in general, the 90 minutes, it was nice actually in a way to get back to the 90 minutes because you suddenly had time to do some of the old Formula One stuff like trying a new front wing or this setup and being able to back it with the previous setup, which was the old system, of course. But these days, never any time to do that. But you saw a couple of teams today, Haas notably with Kevin Magnussen doing back-to-backs. And you'd also think, could you learn much by going out in the wet? And of course you can. Front wing, for example, Alpha, I think, have got a new front wing. They have got a new front wing. And they could see whether or not that was going to generate more downforce and be more efficient, let's put it that way, aerodynamically, than its predecessor in the wet. And it seemed to do quite a good job. Valtteri Bottas was quite quick. It was interesting to see quite a lot of the drivers getting back into Suzuka again. I thought Charles Leclerc looked as if he'd just woken up or something. He just looked all over the place when he was driving. Didn't seem to be dancing the music through 1A, 1B, all through the S's. Not bad on the last half of the lap, but he was completely out of position every lap I saw him. And he was going on about, the car, I just don't have the feel for the car yet. But then he did say, typically Charles, but I need to keep working at this. So I think tomorrow you'll see a completely different Charles, as you'll see a completely different Suzuka, of course, because it's going to be, in theory, it's going to be dry tomorrow. Possibility of rain on the Sunday, but good fun tomorrow, 1 hour FP3 with all the teams having to adapt to the circuit in the dry, very little time to try anything. I wonder whether any teams will get any full tank running in FP3 tomorrow. Interesting to see whether Red Bull will with either Sergio Perez or Max Verstappen. They seem to be the best at the moment in terms of getting getting that race mileage in an FP3 or an FP2, given dry weather. As we saw, when the track was getting a little bit drier towards the end, and what did Red Bull do? Put fuel in the car and ran both Max and Perez on fuel in these semi-wet conditions. Just shows the attention to detail these days at Red Bull. So let's have a look at the laps. Max, look at the consistency, 46.1, 47.6, 55.5, cooling the tyres, I guess, 46.8, 46.9, 47.2. Sergio Perez, 46.2, 46.2, 45.9, 46.4, 47.4, 47.1, 46.8, 48.1, 47.3. And all this at a time when Ferrari were nowhere to be seen. Perhaps an important point when we get to Sunday, although bearing in mind it will be dry tomorrow, you could argue that maybe the lessons learned at this point wouldn't be too significant. But having said that, there's going to be a lot of other stuff to do in the dry in FP3 anyway, so that's a nice bit of homework that Red Bull have already done. The teams will have one extra set of dry tyres to take into FP3 tomorrow, so there'll be non-stop action and running tomorrow, and that's a good thing, of course. You know, it's a great thing for Formula 1, great thing for the Japanese fans, the long-suffering Japanese fans. For the record, Fernando Alonso quickest in the first session, and George Russell looking really good, again, looking really good in the Mercedes. A little bit sharper, I thought, than Lewis today in terms of where he was positioning the car, what he was doing. Lewis, nothing like as out of bed as Charles Leclerc, but looked a little bit, yeah, you know, it is only a Friday and it is wet, so we'll just see what happens. But George right on it, looked really nice, I thought. And as I say, Fernando quickest in the first session. No real surprise there, you know, Fernando Alonso is who he is. And Max Verstappen, there or thereabouts, not doing anything stupid, but out there looking pretty good in the Red Bull and pretty consistent throughout. So predictions for tomorrow, you know, inevitably it's going to be Red Bull, Ferrari, Mercedes. Lando Norris, I thought, looked really good as well in the McLaren. So it's going to be an interesting battle around Suzuka, I think, between McLaren and Alpine. Having said all of that, I'd just like to go back. It's unusual to do that in one of these videos because we're always referring to what's happened in the action on that day, because there wasn't that much action. Oh, I should mention Mick Schumacher looked pretty good in the Haas until after his practice start at the end of FP1. He was driving back to the pits and put the power down, through some standing water. The car aquaplaned and went off into the barrier, and he wasn't able to run in FP2. So more than anything, that's a black mark for Mick, I'm afraid, at a time when he needs to have as many ticks next to his name as possible just to keep everything going for 2023. I'm not saying it's all over for him, but it happened at that time of the year, just on an in-lap, in effect. Not a great thing, sadly, for Mick. But yeah, going back to what I was saying, normally we just look back at the events of the day, but as Singapore was only last week, I'd just like to look back at one thing that's happened, and I have mentioned this on my live stream, and that is that Mercedes, as is their wont, really good that they do this, I think. They did a piece this time with James Allison, proactive piece, just staring at the camera, which is not easy to do, just ramble on, as I am at the moment. No, but James doing a very good job, bearing in mind he is who he is, looking into the lens, talking about what went wrong, basically, in Singapore. And everything was kind of made sense. To me, anyway. I'm talking about my own personal understanding here. But then he got to the point where he was talking about the race and why, and actually answering a question, I don't know if it was a real question or not, but a question as to why the relative performance in the race didn't look as good as that in qualifying, bearing in mind the conditions weren't that far apart. Obviously, it was a little bit drier towards the end of qualifying, but Lewis was quick in all conditions in qualifying, but not that quick in the race, and slower, indeed, than Carlos Sainz. And by the time, well, he never really got sorted, did he? The whole Sainz thing ruined his race, and that was because Lewis, on the greasy, rubber, clean side of the grid, if you like, qualifying in P3, where the rubber is laid, because that's where it is in the dry. In the wet, that transformed itself into sort of greasy start, and he got blown away by Carlos Sainz going into the first corner. So Lewis is on the outside, and you don't often see Lewis, since this whole sporting reg about if you're on the outside, basically you're always in the right. I haven't seen Lewis put himself in that position. He's quite often been on the inside with people trying to pass him and edge them out, and he's the one that's got the penalty. So he's on the outside of Sainz going into one, which is a left-hander. And Sainz does his logical thing and uses all the roads. So Lewis then has to go into the runoff area, which is the infield, if you like. And it's quite, yeah, you can tell there under the lights, there's quite a lot of water there. I wouldn't have said it's massive standing water, but he goes through it and does a good job, you've got to say, to get back, and only having lost that one position to Carlos Sainz. And then I've got to say, you know, I don't think there's anybody better on the planet. There may be some people as good, but nobody better on the planet than Lewis if the tyres are a bit cold, it is semi-wet, he's on intermediates. This is Lewis Hamilton territory. He's absolutely brilliant in that area. And he then, and I've made a note of it because I think it's worth saying, he then, over the next 5 laps, this was the gap between Sainz and Lewis Hamilton. 2 seconds, 2.3, 2.1, 4.5, and then got it back to 2.6. Now, that's, you may say, well, that's not too bad, is it? That's okay. That's okay. But bear in mind, at this point, Carlos Sainz was dropping back massively from Sergio Perez and Charles Leclerc. So he was way off the pace. So at the end of lap 1, the gap, these are the gaps now between the leader of the race, Sergio Perez, and Lewis Hamilton. This is how slowly he was actually going. 5 seconds, 6.6, 7.4, 8.7, 9.9, 10 seconds behind after 5 laps. And 2 seconds, 2.5 seconds at this point behind Carlos Sainz. Now, I've made the point, and I made the point in the video after Singapore, that this was, if ever there was a race and a moment when Mercedes potentially could really fight for a win, it was going to be Singapore, particularly in those conditions where the damp effectively nullified any porpoising that might have been there in the dry. So for Mercedes, high downforce car, Lewis Hamilton qualifying right at the front, this was a real opportunity. And yet, after 4 laps of Singapore, he was 4.5 seconds behind Carlos Sainz, who was 8.7 seconds behind Sergio Perez. That's how slowly they were going. And Lewis could do nothing about it. He was dropping away. And I said at the time, you know, this is something that's really disappointing, because if ever was going to be a moment when Mercedes was a step up, it was going to be now. And they didn't actually, they went backwards. And to my surprise, when asked about this, James Allison said, well, you know, Lewis's first phase of the race was basically ruined by that first corner incident, because in going through standing water in that infield, even before turn 2, his tyre temperatures dropped at least 10 degrees. And that, you know, took a long time for that to come up to temperature again. And that is what I'm confused about, because these are intermediates. They're pretty soft at the best of times. And by lap 3, Sergio Perez was using any water he could find in a straight line to keep the tyres cool. So they were getting up to temperature pretty efficiently. By lap 1, first corner, nobody's tyres were up to temperature anyway. So actually for Lewis's tyres to be 10 degrees cooler than they were anyway, I find that a little bit hard to understand how they've managed to establish that. But I suppose they can get that from the sensors. But are you telling me that you can't regain that 10 degrees over the next couple of corners and get Lewis back in right behind Carlos Sainz, forcing him into an error? The implication from this is that the intermediate Pirelli takes far too long to get back to temperature. So as I say, I thought I'd contact my friends at Pirelli to see and just ask them the straight question. If you go through standing water on intermediates at the start of the race, how long would it take to get the intermediates back to temperature again? And here's the answer that's come from Pirelli at Suzuka right now. Hi Peter, very little time, just a couple of corners. So there's 2 things there. One is, well, there's 2 options really. One, either James is liberal with what happened for some reason that I can't really understand, other than perhaps to say that the car's poor performance in that early phase was due to Lewis going off and putting a little bit of the focus on Lewis in a fairly gentle way. Or the Mercedes did get its temperatures back very quickly on those intermediates, and then it was in serious tyre temperature trouble anyway, getting them up to normal temperature. Maybe they were always running 10, 15 degrees cooler than Ferrari, for example, in that first 8 laps of the race. And if that's the case, then it's a really, really weird problem, because you would imagine that the Mercedes, with being a high downforce car, would actually be putting more energy through its tyres than Ferrari or perhaps even Red Bull in the setup they were running. So either way you cut it, it's a very strange thing. And I'm not in any way decrying Mercedes putting out a YouTube video with James to explain what happened in the race. But I think there are some things that if they put them out and they raise more questions than they do give explanations, then you wonder really what it's all about. So anyway, I thought I'd make that point. I think today it was quite significant at Suzuka when Lewis said, the one thing he did establish straight away was that we got the tyre temperature problem sorted, something on words to that effect, which suggests that maybe, you know, regardless of that business with going through the standing water and taking a long time to get the temperatures back, regardless of that, Mercedes kind of feel that they weren't on top of temperatures with the intermediate in Singapore. But that really is weird, isn't it? Because Lewis was really quick, as was George when he was out there on intermediates. But Lewis particularly in qualifying and in FP3. So none of it, I mean, I wouldn't have said they had, if you looked at Singapore from 30,000 feet, you wouldn't have come away from that race saying Mercedes have got really big problems with tyre temperature, tyre warming on intermediates. You'd look at what they did on Saturday and, well, I suppose you'd say, well, yeah, but in the race, look at Lewis. But to me, there may be something else going on here, and I don't know what it is, but I hope it isn't. What I hope it isn't is some sort of focus on Lewis. Well, if he hadn't gone off and he'd stayed in front of Carlos, it would have been a completely different race. Of course, it would have been a different race if he'd been in front of Carlos Sainz from the start. That's not the point. The point is when he was behind him in the first phase of the race, Sainz was pulling away. But Sainz was pulling away even though he was going massively slower than his teammate Charles Leclerc. So that both Lewis and Sainz were way off the pace. I mean, look at the gap between Lewis and Sergio Perez after 5 laps. 10 seconds he was behind Perez. Now, you would never have imagined that after qualifying. He was within 100th or 200th of a second of the pole. So anyway, enough of that. I think, sometimes we get all this conflict of information and it's to do with politics or it's to do, well, he said this, he said that. But occasionally we get these little technical things coming through. And to me, they're the most fascinating of all, really, because that actually is the heart of what it is all about. And, I think I still rate Lewis as good as anybody I've ever seen, I've got to say, on intermediates or cold tyres and in those conditions. And I'm still waiting really for an explanation as to why he couldn't get anywhere near Carlos Sainz in that first phase of the race. Because had he been able to put pressure on him, force Sainz into some sort of lock-up, he could and got in front in the first 5 laps, 6 laps, it would have been a different race for him for sure. Anyway, enough of that. At Friday, a washout in Suzuka in most ways, not in every way, of course, because the Japanese fans saw Formula One cars again going around that amazing John Hugenholtz designed Suzuka circuit. John Hugenholtz, of course, designed the original Zandvoort as well. But tomorrow will be a different day. It'll be dry. Looking forward to that very much. See you then.